By the fourth day, Adriana Vale saved the seat across from me. The entire headquarters had decided we were sleeping together. We had not even touched. I found out about the rumor the way I found out about most things at Morrow and Vale, which was secondhand, in the elevator, from two people who did not realize I was standing directly behind them. By then, Adriana had already claimed the small table by the tall windows 3 times, the one I had eaten at almost every day for 2 years, the one nobody else wanted because the afternoon sun hit it wrong in summer. She was sitting there again when I walked into the cafeteria that 4th day, a cup of tea going cold in front of her, an untouched plate of something grilled and sensible beside it, and directly across from her, impossibly, absurdly, a chair with nothing on it at all. A finance associate I vaguely recognized reached for that chair the way you reach for the last seat on a crowded train, without thinking, just relief at finding space. Adriana did not look up from whatever she was reading on her tablet. "That seat is occupied," she said. The associate glanced around like there might be a coat draped somewhere I'd missed. There wasn't. The chair was empty. He apologized anyway, the way you apologize to weather, and found another table. I stood near the tray return, with my lunch going lukewarm in my hands, and understood, with a kind of dread that felt embarrassingly close to something else, that the chair was for me. Adriana looked up then, not searching. She had known exactly where I was the whole time, which should have unsettled me more than it did. "You're 7 minutes late," she said. "I didn't realize lunch had become a scheduled meeting," I said, because if I let the silence stretch, I was going to do something humiliating, like blush in front of 400 employees. "It hasn't." "Then why are you keeping time?" She didn't answer that. She just watched me with an expression I would spend the next several months learning to read, and gestured, almost imperceptibly, at the chair. I want to be clear that nothing about walking over and sitting down felt inevitable. It felt like choosing to step off a curb into traffic that had, so far, always stopped. But I sat, because refusing would have made a bigger scene than sitting, and because some small, traitorous part of me was curious, in a way I did not examine too closely. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. Adriana Vale did not eat with employees. This was not office legend the way some things at Morrow and Vale were office legend, exaggerated over years, until nobody remembered the original shape of the truth. It was simply, verifiably, true. She took her meals in her office, alone, or she skipped them, and in 9 years as CEO, no one had a confirmed memory of watching her eat anything heavier than black coffee during business hours. People called her the Ice Alpha when they thought she couldn't hear, and she could always hear, and she never once reacted to it, which somehow made the nickname stick harder. So when she asked, in that first lunch, what I thought of the redesigned collaboration pods on the 4th floor, I assumed this was reconnaissance. I told her I thought they were an expensive way to make people feel surveilled while pretending to feel inspired. She asked what I would replace them with. I talked for almost 10 minutes about acoustics and scent-neutral airflow and the difference between a space designed to look collaborative in photographs and a space that actually lowered anyone's stress hormones, and I did not touch my food once. She pushed my unopened yogurt an inch toward me with 2 fingers. "Don't manage my lunch," I said, sharper than I meant to. She moved her hand back immediately. Fair. It was such a small correction. I did not understand yet how rare it was for her to make one. Near the end, when I had run out of things to say about workplace acoustics, and the silence had gone almost comfortable, she asked me something that had nothing to do with any of it. "Why do you sit here every day?" This table, I mean, not the cafeteria in general. I told her the light was good and nobody bothered me, and that felt true enough not to examine further. She nodded like she was filing the answer away somewhere, finished her tea, and left without another word. I assumed that was the end of it, A CEO satisfying some passing anthropological curiosity about the people 3 floors below her office, checking a box, moving on. She was there again the next day. The chair across from her was empty again. She had saved it again. That was when I understood something was actually starting, and I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The lunches that followed did not feel like courtship, not at first. They felt like an argument that kept adjourning and reconvening. She would ask about employee sentiment, and I would ask why she needed anecdotes when she had an entire research department, meaning me, filing formal reports she apparently skimmed. She admitted, eventually, that people spoke differently in a conference room with her name on the door than they did over a cafeteria tray. I told her that was an insight roughly 4,000 years old, and she'd reached it just now, at 40, over reheated soup. She almost smiled. I started keeping count of the almost smiles, which I did not tell anyone, including myself, meant anything. On the second lunch, she asked me, with the same flat precision she probably used to interrogate quarterly projections, whether I thought the company's parental leave policy actually served hourly employees or only looked good in the annual report. I told her the honest answer required data I didn't have memorized, and she said she wasn't asking for a report, she was asking what I'd noticed. So I told her what I'd noticed, that the warehouse staff took their leave in fragments because they couldn't afford the unpaid gaps, that the corporate staff took theirs in full because they could, that the policy was technically equal and functionally nothing of the sort. She didn't write anything down. She just looked at me for a second too long and said, "Send me the interview transcripts," which I did, that same afternoon, and heard nothing back about for 11 days, until she mentioned offhand, over lunch, that she'd read every one of them twice. On the third lunch, I brought up the lemon bars, mostly to fill silence, and was startled to discover she genuinely did not know the cafeteria sold lemon bars, had apparently never once looked at the dessert case in 9 years of walking past it toward her office. I made her try one! She ate it in 3 careful bites, evaluating it with the seriousness of a woman reviewing a term sheet, and pronounced it acceptable, which from her, I would learn, counted as a rave review. I told her that was the most backhanded compliment I'd ever heard given to a baked good. She said she didn't hand out compliments she didn't mean, backhanded or otherwise, and something about the flatness of how she said it made me believe her completely. By the second week, I'd stopped bracing for the lunches to end, and started, without quite admitting it to myself, looking forward to them. She asked once why I always ordered the same soup on Wednesdays, and I told her it was the day the kitchen actually made it from scratch instead of reheating a bag, a fact she confirmed later that same week, by walking directly into the kitchen and asking the head cook herself, which mortified me and delighted the kitchen staff in roughly equal measure. She reported back that I was correct, as if I'd needed the confirmation, as if my knowing the cafeteria's internal schedule better than its CEO was itself data worth verifying. She kept a small, private list of things she was learning about the building she'd worked in for 9 years, without really seeing that the elevator on the east side ran 4 seconds faster than the one on the west, which the facilities team, when she finally asked, could not explain. That an entire floor of engineers had an unofficial betting pool about which meetings would run long, and that I had apparently been in it since before she knew it existed. That the plants in the lobby were fake, all of them, something she discovered by trying to water one out of some sudden impulse toward maintenance and finding dry silk leaves instead of soil. I laughed so hard at that one that Priya, 2 tables over, turned around to see what had happened, and Adriana looked faintly, uncharacteristically pleased with herself for having caused it. I learned things about her in fragments, the way you learn a new language, mostly through mistakes. She did not know which dessert disappeared first from the case, which was the lemon bars, gone by 11:40 every day without exception. She had no idea why the entire design team hated the expensive innovation pods enough to hold a small, unofficial funeral for the concept in a group chat I was regrettably part of. She ate slowly when she was nervous, which I noticed before I understood I was noticing it, cutting things into smaller and smaller pieces without actually eating them. She always left one specific vegetable on her plate, the same one, every time, pushed to the rim like an unwanted guest. She hated when the coffee machine oversweetened its lattes and complained about it with more feeling than she'd shown about anything in the quarterly earnings call I'd watched the week before. She learned things about me too, though she was quieter about announcing it. She noticed I carried hot sauce in my bag at all times, a habit from childhood I'd never bothered to break. She noticed I read mystery novels at lunch, the kind with a body in the first chapter and a satisfying, orderly resolution by the last, and once asked, with what I swear was genuine curiosity, why I found murder relaxing. She noticed I knew half the cafeteria staff by first name, and that I gave my dessert almost every day to Priya, a junior analyst 2 tables over who forgot to eat when she was stressed, which was constantly. She noticed I took notes on napkins when an idea hit me mid-sentence, and that I could not, under any circumstances, sit through a meeting that used the phrase synergistic alignment without visibly aging. And she noticed, though she did not mention it for almost 2 weeks, that I rubbed the inside of my left wrist when the cafeteria got crowded enough that too many mixed alpha scents stacked on top of each other in the recycled air. I found out she'd noticed when the ventilation above our table changed. It was subtle at first, just a difference in how the room felt by 1 o'clock, less like being underwater in other people's biology. I asked facilities about it and got a vague answer about routine filter maintenance. I let it go for 3 days before I stopped believing in coincidences that convenient and cornered the facilities director, who folded almost immediately and told me the request had come from the CEO's office directly, flagged urgent, 2 weeks earlier. I did not thank Adriana for this. I confronted her with it, at our table, loud enough that a passing employee actually slowed down to eavesdrop before thinking better of it. "You can't just rearrange the building because you noticed something about my wrist," I said. "I didn't rearrange the building. I flagged a maintenance issue." "You flagged a maintenance issue that only I would notice was ever a problem." She was quiet for a second. I watched her decide, visibly, not to defend herself the easy way, the way I'd braced for. "I was only trying to help you." That I had heard so many times from an ex who used those exact words to justify reading my messages, picking my restaurants, deciding which job offers I was allowed to be excited about. "You're right," Adriana said instead. "I should have asked you first." I didn't know what to do with that, so I ate my sandwich and let the moment pass without telling her it had mattered. It mattered enormously. It was the first time I understood she might actually be capable of hearing a correction and changing course, instead of just enduring the correction until it stopped. The whole company noticed the pattern faster than either of us wanted. Within 3 weeks, people had started being strange around me in ways I recognized immediately and hated. A director I'd never spoken to began copying me on emails that had nothing to do with my work. Someone left a bouquet of flowers on my desk with no card, which I initially found sweet until I understood, from the way people's eyes slid off me in the break room afterward, that it had been meant as a joke, or a test, or both. I had spent 6 years building a reputation as someone whose opinions carried weight because of the research behind them, not because of who I ate lunch with, and I could feel that reputation getting quietly, invisibly reassigned to a category I had no interest in occupying. I brought it to Adriana directly, because I had learned by then that indirect complaints bounced off her like weather. "People think I'm sleeping with you for access," I said. "I can stop coming to the cafeteria," she said, immediately, before I'd finished the sentence. And something about how fast she offered it, how easily she was willing to remove herself, hit me harder than I expected. "I didn't say I wanted you gone." "Then what are you asking for?" I didn't have an answer. I sat there with a mouth full of words that refused to arrange themselves into anything useful, and eventually she nodded once, like my silence was itself an answer, and let the subject drop. The next day she wasn't at our table. She was 3 tables away, alone, at a 2-seater near the salad bar, eating with the particular stillness of someone performing indifference for an audience that wasn't watching closely enough to be fooled. I lasted about 5 minutes at our empty table before I picked up my tray, walked over, and sat down across from her without being invited. "Don't make that face," I said when she looked up. "I'm conducting informal executive research, purely professional." Something shifted in her jaw that I would later learn to identify as her trying not to laugh. From that day, the ritual belonged to both of us, not just to her saving a chair and me deciding whether to fill it. The relationship, if that was even the word for it yet, did not stay inside the cafeteria's fluorescent light for long. There was a night, weeks later, when a storm knocked out half the city's transit, and I was still on the research floor at 9, drafting a report on omega retention, with my coat still on, because the heat had cut out along with everything else. Adriana found me there. I expected her to arrange a car for me without asking, the way people with that kind of money often did, mistaking convenience for kindness. Instead, she stood in the doorway and asked if I wanted one. I told her no. I hated being managed, even when the management was well-intentioned, especially when it was well-intentioned, because well-intentioned was exactly how my last relationship had excused every decision it made on my behalf. She accepted the refusal without argument, which surprised me more than an argument would have. We ended up sitting on the floor by the vending machines 2 hours later, trains still down, splitting a bag of crackers that Adriana criticized with real venom for their nutritional dishonesty. Her shoes were off, her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. A piece of hair had come loose from whatever architecture normally held it in place, and she looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like a person instead of a headline. I told her about my mother coming home from restaurant shifts after midnight smelling like fryer oil and sitting at our kitchen table anyway, too tired to do anything but keep me company while I finished homework, because to her, that counted as being a parent, even on the nights she had nothing left to give beyond presence. Adriana went quiet in a way that felt full rather than empty. My family didn't eat like that, she said eventually. Dinner was a performance review with silverware. She didn't elaborate further that night, and I didn't push. I filed it away the way she'd filed away my answer about the light being good at our table, understanding it as a beginning rather than an ending. There was a Saturday, not long after, when I was assigned to evaluate the rooftop garden the company had built years earlier as a wellness initiative, and then quietly abandoned. Adriana joined me there uninvited, carrying 2 coffees, and we ate lunch among untended planters with the city spread out below us, in a way that made the whole thing feel unbearably close to a date. Without the cafeteria's filtered air between us, her scent reached me clearly for the first time. Bergamot and something like cool stone after rain, an edge of dried fig leaf, warmth underneath it all like cardamom held too close to heat. My whole body responded before my mind caught up, and I noticed her notice, and I noticed her deliberately widen the distance between us on the bench. "Why did you just do that?" I asked. "Because attraction isn't permission," she said simply, and went back to her coffee like she hadn't just said something that undid me a little. It should not have moved me as much as it did. It moved me enormously, because the last person who'd wanted me had never once asked whether wanting was the same as being allowed. Weeks after that, stranded outside headquarters after a community outreach event when her car developed some ordinary, unglamorous mechanical problem, I took her to a diner 3 blocks from my old apartment, the kind of place with laminated menus and a pie case that hadn't been updated since before either of us worked here. She read the menu like she was reviewing a contract, turning it over twice, asking the waitress genuine clarifying questions about portion sizes that made the poor woman visibly unsure whether she was being mocked. When the fries came, she ate them with a seriousness that made me laugh so hard the waitress checked on us twice. Adriana laughed too, at herself, a real sound I had genuinely never heard from her before, low and a little rusty, like it hadn't been used in years. "You've never been somewhere like this," I said. It wasn't a question. "I've been to restaurants that would fit inside this restaurant's kitchen," she said. "I don't think I've been somewhere like this since I was younger than you." "What happened?" She considered the question with a fry halfway to her mouth. "My father decided casual dining reflected poorly on the family. After that, it was always somewhere with a wine list and a dress code, even when I was 9. She said it lightly, like a fact about weather, but I noticed she didn't finish the fry. I told her about the diners my mother used to take me to, on her 1 day off a month, back before she saved enough to open her own place, how we'd split a single plate of pancakes because that was the budget and neither of us cared. how some of my best memories of being a kid happened in vinyl booths exactly like the one we were sitting in. Adriana listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without checking her phone once, which I would later learn was its own kind of rare gift from her. The waitress assumed we were together and said something about it when she dropped the check, something warm and unbothered, the kind of comment servers make constantly and mean nothing dramatic by. We both denied it too fast, in the exact same half-second, which the waitress found more convincing evidence than anything either of us could have said in our defense. She left without another word, smiling in a way that made my face go hot for reasons I refused to examine on a full stomach of diner fries. My mother, Marianne, ran a small restaurant 2 neighborhoods over, and I had to help there one evening when a line cook called out sick and she was short-staffed. Adriana showed up an hour in, unannounced, holding a folder I'd left at the office that afternoon, something confidential enough that she'd decided against sending it by courier. My mother took one look at both of us and understood everything before either of us said a word. She handed Adriana a stack of clean plates and told her, in the exact tone she used on every other person who wandered into her kitchen, that she could move those to table 6 if she wanted to stand around looking useless. Adriana obeyed. I stood there mortified, watching one of the most powerful executives in the country carry dinnerware between tables in a restaurant that sat 40 people on a good night, and some part of me that I hadn't known was braced for disaster finally relaxed. My mother kept up a steady stream of instructions the entire evening, none of them gentle, all of them exactly the tone she used on every other pair of hands in her kitchen. Fold the napkins this way, not that way. Table 9 wants their check. Table 9 has wanted their check for 10 minutes. Table 9 is going to start a small riot. Adriana absorbed every correction without a trace of the defensiveness I half expected from a woman used to giving orders rather than receiving them, and by the end of the night she was refilling water glasses with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd apparently decided, somewhere in the last 2 hours, that she was good at this and intended to prove it. We ate leftovers together after close, the 3 of us at a small table near the kitchen, plates that didn't match, a candle my mother lit out of habit rather than romance. Adriana told my mother, unprompted, that it was the first dinner she'd had in longer than she wanted to admit that hadn't felt like being watched. My mother didn't make a large moment of it. She just reached over and refilled Adriana's glass without being asked, the same way she'd have done for any regular who'd earned it, and said, "Then come back," like it was the simplest instruction in the world. Adriana looked for a moment like she might actually cry, which was so far outside anything I'd seen from her that I nearly reached for her hand right there at the table, in front of my mother, in front of everything. I didn't, not yet, but I understood then, though I didn't say it out loud, exactly how much that saved cafeteria chair had actually cost her, how enormous an act of trust it had been disguised as something as small as routine. I found out how much a few weeks later, when a brutal board confrontation left her drained in a way that wasn't dramatic so much as depleting, some reaction to overtaxed scent blockers that left her steady but hollowed out. I went home with her that night because leaving felt wrong, and her house turned out to be the loneliest, beautiful place I had ever stood inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking over a garden, clearly maintained by someone who was not her. A staircase wide enough for 4 people to climb it shoulder to shoulder. The dining room could have seated 14, and looked like it hadn't seated one in years. The chairs pushed in with a precision that suggested nobody had pulled one out in a long time. The refrigerator held almost nothing, a few condiments, a carton of eggs past its date, a bottle of expensive wine that looked like it had been a gift rather than a choice. "You could feed a small country in that dining room," I said, "and you're eating condiments alone in here." "I don't use the dining room," she said, like it was obvious. "I haven't used it since I bought the house." I made something simple from what there was, eggs and toast and whatever herbs I could find in a spice rack that looked untouched, and she sat on the kitchen counter instead of at that enormous unused table, watching me cook with an attention that felt like being memorized. She asked questions about what I was doing with a genuine curiosity that made me realize, somewhere around the second egg, that she had probably never actually watched anyone cook a meal for her in this house before. Not staff, not a catered event, just someone standing at her stove because they wanted to be there. We ate standing at the counter, close enough that our shoulders kept brushing, and the conversation slowed the way conversation does, right before it stops being conversation at all. She reached up and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear, her hand lingering at my jaw, and I felt the whole kitchen narrow down to the 6 inches of space between us. I could smell her clearly here, no filtered air working against it. Bergamot and rain-cooled stone, and underneath it something warmer that I'd started to recognize as what she smelled like when she wanted something, and was holding perfectly still so she wouldn't reach for it. We got close enough that night that I thought we might finally kiss. She stopped an inch before it happened, her forehead resting against mine for one long, suspended second, breathing like the stillness was costing her something physical. "I want to," she said, low enough it barely qualified as sound. "I need you to know that, but your name came up on a short list this week, and I will not let anything between us start while that's still unresolved. Not like this. Not where it could ever look like it started as leverage." She stepped back before I could argue. I felt the rejection anyway, even understanding the reason behind it, even respecting it. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to separate the two feelings. The ache of being wanted and denied at once. The strange gratitude underneath it for a restraint I hadn't known to ask for. The promotion was real, and it mattered to me more than almost anything in my career so far. Director of Workplace Equity and Design, a role built from scratch around exactly the kind of research I'd spent years doing, one of 3 finalists chosen by an independent panel that had nothing to do with Adriana. I found out, secondhand, from another executive in an elevator who clearly assumed I already knew, that Adriana had quietly recused herself from any part of the hiring decision the moment my name appeared on that shortlist. She hadn't told me first. I went to her office that evening, past her assistant, past the hour when anyone reasonable would have left for the day, and I did not bother softening the entrance. "You recused yourself from my promotion, and let me hear about it in an elevator," I said. She set down whatever she was reading, slowly, the way she did when she was buying herself a second to choose her words with care. I was trying to protect the process from any appearance of favoritism. By making a decision about my career without telling me first. It wasn't a decision about your career. It was a decision about my own conduct. It affects my career either way. Adriana, everyone in that building is going to spend the next month deciding whether I earned this on my own or got it because you stepped aside to make it look clean. You didn't ask me which version of that story I could live with. You just decided. I was furious, in a way that surprised even me, the kind of furious that has roots older than the thing that triggered it. I told her I was tired of powerful alphas rearranging my life around what they'd decided, without asking me, was safest for me, that I had spent 2 years unlearning exactly this instinct in someone else, and I was not interested in relearning it here. She went quiet, and I watched something land on her face, some recognition of the parallel she clearly hadn't seen coming until I said it out loud. "You're right," she said finally. "I should have told you before I did it, not after. I was so focused on making sure I never became the reason anyone doubted you that I didn't consider I might become that reason anyway, just by staying silent." She didn't reach for me. She kept her hands flat on the desk, like she understood touching me right then would have been its own kind of decision made without asking. "I'm sorry. I'll ask first from now on, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." It was a real apology, not a performance of one, and I believed it. But belief didn't dissolve the underlying problem. We both wanted this. We both knew it complicated my career in ways neither of us could fully control, no matter how carefully we tried. And no apology, however sincere, was going to make that complication disappear before it had run its course. That was the state of things when Lenora Graves decided to act. Lenora had been Adriana's chief operating officer for almost 15 years, and she was not, whatever else she became to me over the following months, stupid or cartoonishly cruel. She had built a career on the belief that discipline was the only thing separating a company that survived from one that didn't. And she believed, with real conviction, that CEOs couldn't afford visible personal attachments to employees. She believed my proposed reforms were expensive and idealistic, in ways that risked the company's stability during a difficult quarter. And she wasn't entirely wrong about the cost, only about what the cost was worth. I'd sat across from her in exactly 2 meetings before any of this started, and both times she'd asked sharp, fair questions about my data that I respected even while disagreeing with her conclusions. Her arguments, on their own, were the kind you could actually debate in good faith. Her deeper flaw was that she saw employees as systems to be optimized rather than people to be listened to, and she viewed Adriana's growing attachment to me as both a personal weakness and a governance risk worth eliminating before it cost the company something larger than a single scandal. She started collecting things, quietly, over weeks. Photographs of our lunches, taken from across the cafeteria by someone she'd clearly asked or paid to look the other way about ethics. The ventilation request, dated and time-stamped, pulled from a facilities system she had every legitimate reason to access. Adriana's recusal from my promotion process logged in a governance system Lenora reviewed as part of her role. None of it proved wrongdoing on its own. Assembled together and leaked to a business journalist the week before the board was set to vote on my reform proposal, it told a story that was devastating precisely because it was almost, technically, true. The article ran under a headline that used the word favor 3 separate times. It implied I'd gained unusual access to the CEO through a personal relationship. It implied the ventilation change had been a private favor disguised as maintenance, dressed up in bureaucratic language to survive scrutiny. It implied my imminent promotion existed because Adriana favored me, and that my research recommendations, the years of interviews and data I'd built my entire professional identity on, were compromised by proximity to power. It named me, in full, in the second paragraph. It printed a photograph of the 2 of us at our table, heads close together over lunch, both of us mid-laugh at something I couldn't even remember anymore, that made an ordinary Tuesday look like a confession caught on camera. I became the center of a kind of scrutiny I had spent my whole career trying to avoid. Colleagues who had trusted my judgment for years grew careful around me overnight, choosing their words in meetings like I might report back to Adriana what they'd said. A vendor I'd worked with for 2 years sent a painfully formal email asking to confirm the current process for future proposals, which I understood, reading between every line, to mean he no longer trusted that my recommendations were mine. Worse than the public humiliation was what a few Omega coworkers said to me quietly, almost apologetically, in the days after, that a scandal like this fed exactly the stereotype they fought against constantly, at every level of the company, that Omegas advanced through alpha attachment instead of competence, that every hard-won promotion any of them ever received would now carry a shadow of doubt it hadn't carried the week before. That comment sat in my chest for days like something swallowed wrong, heavier than anything the article itself had managed to do to me directly. Adriana wanted to fight it immediately, publicly. She wanted to issue a statement. She wanted legal to threaten the publication. She wanted to reveal her recusal herself, to prove there'd been no interference. I told her no to all of it, because any defense from her right now would only confirm the story's premise, that my career existed inside the shape of her attention, rather than beside it. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, and I could hear how much the question cost her. A woman who had spent her entire adult life deciding things and then executing the decision. "Nothing," I said. "For once, nothing." She didn't come to the cafeteria the next day. I told myself the silence between us was necessary, professional, temporary. I kept eating at our table anyway, because changing my routine felt like losing something on top of everything else I was already losing. For the first few days, nobody sat across from me. People had started associating that particular chair with her, and an empty chair across from the woman at the center of a scandal apparently read as a warning to stay away. I ate alone with a book I wasn't reading, turning pages at a rhythm that had nothing to do with comprehension, aware the whole time of the empty chair the way you're aware of a missing tooth, my attention circling back to it whether I wanted it to or not. Priya sat with me twice that week out of what I recognized, gratefully, as deliberate loyalty rather than habit, and didn't ask a single question about the article, which was its own kind of kindness. Other people asked. A few asked with real concern, and I appreciated them for it. A few asked with the particular brightness of someone hoping for details they could repeat later, and I got very good, that week, at giving answers with no usable content in them at all. On the fourth day, a new intern I didn't recognize, clearly too new to have absorbed any of the office's careful new choreography around that table, asked whether the seat across from me was free. I said yes. It was such an ordinary question, asked with such complete indifference to everything the chair had come to mean, that I had to excuse myself to the restroom afterward and stand very still at the sink until I stopped being close to crying over a piece of furniture. The intern's name was Dana. She talked for 20 minutes about a project she was nervous about, entirely unaware she'd just handed me the first normal conversation I'd had in days, and I was more grateful to her than she would ever know. I learned, through a cafeteria worker who mentioned it without any idea of the weight it carried, that Adriana's standing lunch order had stopped. She was working through meals again, the way she must have for years before any of this started, back behind her office door with nobody watching to notice the pattern had returned. I was furious that the information hurt as much as it did, furious at myself for keeping count of an absence, furious at the whole situation for making silence feel like the only responsible choice, when every part of me wanted to walk up to her office and undo it. I saw her twice that week, briefly, in the kind of hallway encounters that used to feel charged and now just felt hollow. Once in an elevator, both of us saying nothing, the doors closing on a silence so total I could hear the building's ventilation hum. Once outside a conference room, where she asked, with careful neutrality, whether I was doing all right, and I said fine, because fine was the only word small enough to get through the moment, without either of us saying something we couldn't take back in a hallway full of witnesses. I found her alone on the executive floor late one night, weeks into the silence, lights mostly off, just her desk lamp and the glow of the city through the windows behind her. She looked up when I came in like she'd half expected me, and half didn't believe it. I sat down across from her desk, uninvited, and something in me finally broke open enough to ask the question I'd been circling since her house. Why does eating with people cost you so much? She was quiet long enough that I thought she might deflect the way she'd deflected the first time, but she didn't. She set down her pen, folded her hands, and told me, finally, without the armor she usually kept polished for exactly this kind of exposure. Every dinner in my childhood home was a performance review with silverware. I told you that once. I didn't tell you the rest. She looked past me, at nothing in particular, the way people look when they're watching a memory instead of a room. I had an older brother, Marcus. He was an alpha too, but his instincts ran differently than mine, less controlled, more visible, and my father treated that as a failure of discipline instead of what it actually was. He corrected him for it constantly, publicly, at the table, in front of guests, over dinners that were supposed to be celebrations. My father would find some way to remind everyone at that table exactly what was wrong with his son. Her voice didn't shake, but it went very flat, the way voices go when someone has practiced not letting them shake. Marcus struggled for years after he left home. Addiction, isolation. He'd call sometimes, and I never knew what to say to him, because everything I'd learned about family conversation was how to survive being evaluated, not how to actually reach someone. He died when I was 26. My father called it a tragedy at his funeral, like it had simply happened to him, rather than being something he'd had a hand in causing. I didn't say anything. I understood, watching her, that interrupting this would cost her more than letting it finish would cost me. After that, I stopped eating with almost anyone. It wasn't calculated. I didn't decide, consciously, that meals were dangerous. I just noticed, over time, that I'd built an entire life where nobody watched me eat, and it felt like relief instead of loneliness, so I never questioned it. At executive dinners I can perform. I know exactly which version of myself belongs at that table, and I can hold that version for hours if I have to. At a private meal I can't perform anything. There's nothing to hide behind. So I simply stopped attending them, and the company built an entire mythology around it, and I let them, because the mythology was easier to live inside than the truth. She looked at me then, directly, for the first time since she'd started talking. The first day I sat across from you, I expected to stay 10 minutes. I told myself it was reconnaissance. Then you argued with me about employee surveys and stole my bread roll without asking permission. And somewhere in the middle of that argument, I forgot to feel watched. She stopped, visibly frustrated with herself for how clumsy the words came out, and had to start again, twice, like the sentence kept slipping out of reach. I started saving that chair before I understood why I was doing it. I told myself it was useful, efficient, informative. I ran out of reasons eventually, and just kept doing it anyway. I understand now what I was actually doing. I was hoping you'd keep choosing to sit in it. Every single day, I was hoping. It was not a grand declaration. It stumbled and corrected itself twice. It was, somehow, more romantic for exactly that reason. More true for costing her visibly more than a smooth speech would have. I didn't reconcile with her on the spot, because being wanted and being professionally safe were not, I'd learned, automatically the same thing. She agreed, quietly, that they weren't. The independent panel selected me for the director role days later, with no input from Adriana at all. I nearly declined it anyway, worried that accepting anything while the scandal was still breathing would follow me for years. My mother told me not to surrender something I'd earned just to make strangers more comfortable. A friend from research put it more sharply: if I declined because of Adriana, then Adriana's influence had still determined the outcome, just through absence instead of presence. I accepted, but only after drafting my own conditions rather than waiting for anyone to offer them, sitting at my kitchen table for a full weekend with a legal pad and every worst-case scenario I could imagine. My division would report to an independent board committee, not to Adriana, with a reporting line that never once ran through her office. Every budget decision would follow documented process, logged and reviewable by anyone who asked. Adriana would have no authority whatsoever over my compensation, my reviews, or my advancement, not now and not later, regardless of anything that happened between us personally. Any personal relationship between us would be disclosed under formal conflict policy going forward, updated the moment its terms changed. My recommendations would be independently audited by a firm neither of us selected. Employees would have an anonymous channel to report any concern about favoritism, including against me specifically, a channel I insisted stay open even after the scandal faded, because trust rebuilt quietly is still trust that has to be checked. I brought the list to Adriana expecting resistance on at least one point, some quiet argument about efficiency or precedent. She read it twice, in silence, and then signed her name to the bottom of a document she hadn't written a single line of, agreeing to every term without trying to soften a single one. "You could have asked for more," she said when she handed it back. "I would have given you more." I told her this wasn't about what she was willing to give me. It was about what I needed to be certain of on my own terms, and that distinction mattered to me more than the promotion itself, more than anything she could have offered instead. The board meeting where my reform package came up for approval was the closest thing this whole ordeal had to a real reckoning. I stood at the front of a room full of people who had spent the last 3 weeks reading about me in a business publication, and I made myself look at each of them individually, instead of at the table as a blur of skepticism. Lenora went first, and her argument wasn't a straw man built to be knocked down. She walked through the projected costs of the scent-neutral renovations, the protected break periods, the redesigned quiet rooms, and laid them against a quarter that had already come in soft. "I'm not questioning the intent," she said, in a tone that made clear she absolutely was questioning something. "I'm questioning whether this is the year for it, and whether the process that produced this proposal has been as clean as we'd like to believe." I defended the proposal with what I actually had: retention data broken down by designation and department, showing exactly where the company bled talent and why. Exit interview patterns going back 4 years, patterns nobody had ever assembled into one document before, because nobody had ever cared enough to ask. The real cost of turnover, calculated against the cost of the renovations, a number large enough that even the board members who'd walked in skeptical visibly recalculated something behind their eyes. Testimony. Direct quotes I'd been given permission to use, from hourly employees who had never once been asked their opinion of anything by anyone above the level of shift supervisor. I answered every question Lenora raised about cost with a number, and every number I had was real. because I had spent 2 years making sure it would be. Adriana stayed almost entirely silent through all of it, hands folded, giving nothing away, and I understood that silence cost her considerably more than speaking would have, because supporting me too visibly in that room would have handed Lenora exactly the argument she was waiting to make. Lenora made it anyway. I'd be remiss, she said, turning slightly toward Adriana, if I didn't raise the elephant in this room. Miss Harper's proposal is being evaluated by a board that knows perfectly well she and our CEO have a personal relationship. I don't say that to embarrass anyone. I say it because governance requires we ask whether her access and the resources already quietly redirected on her behalf have compromised the objectivity of what we're being asked to approve today. I answered it myself before Adriana could open her mouth, because I understood, with total clarity, that if she answered it for me, the story would only calcify. Yes, Adriana and I have feelings for each other, I said, to the whole room, without letting my voice shrink around the sentence. We built formal safeguards the moment that became true, specifically because we took it seriously enough to protect this process, rather than trusting our own good intentions. My compensation, my reporting line, my performance reviews, all of it now runs through channels she has no authority over, by my design, not hers. And I'd ask this board to consider something else. If an Omega employee's professional judgment automatically becomes suspect the instant a powerful alpha cares about her, regardless of the safeguards built around that fact, then this company is proving, in real time, in this room, exactly the kind of designation bias my research has spent 2 years documenting. You'd be voting to confirm the very prejudice this proposal exists to dismantle. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet before I'd spoken. Someone asked Adriana directly whether the relationship had influenced her judgment. She answered without hesitation, her voice level in a way I recognized as costing her real effort. My feelings are not Ellis Harper's conflict to carry. They're mine, and I've structured my recusal specifically so they never become hers. I welcome any independent review of my own conduct this board wants to run, on any timeline, with full access to anything I have. What I will not do is let this board punish her work because I happen to love the person who did it. She hadn't said the word love to me yet, not directly, not outside a story stumbling toward it in her office. Hearing her say it there first, in front of a room of people deciding my career, undid something in my chest that took the rest of the meeting to put back together. The leak was eventually traced back to Lenora through a legitimate internal investigation. No dramatic confrontation involved, just documents and timestamps that didn't match her account. She resigned before the board could remove her, and her departure, along with her original arguments about governance risk, led directly to stronger conflict of interest policies across the company, which meant even the worst thing she did produced something structurally useful in the end. The board approved a modified version of my reforms. Not everything I'd asked for. Some of it phased in over years rather than immediately, but real, and I felt proud walking out of that room rather than simply relieved. I went back to my office afterward and worked for hours, letting the adrenaline drain out slowly, and only realized how late it had gotten when my stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten. I went down to the cafeteria near 2, past the lunch rush, the room quieter than usual. Our table by the windows was empty. Adriana wasn't there yet. For the first time since any of this began, I was the one who arrived first. I sat down, and on impulse, I put my bag on the chair across from me. She found me a few minutes later, stopped when she saw the bag occupying her usual seat, and I watched her work out what it meant before I said anything. I moved the bag. "Seat's not occupied anymore," I said. "It's saved. For you, specifically, if you're interested." She sat down like she was afraid the invitation might evaporate if she moved too fast. We didn't talk about the board for a while. We just ate, and the silence between us felt nothing like the silence of the last several weeks. Close, instead of empty. Eventually, I told her I'd accepted the promotion. She congratulated me simply, without turning it into more than it needed to be, which by then I recognized as one of her better qualities. "And the disclosure form has a section for personal relationships," I said. She went very still, in the way I'd learned meant she was paying complete attention. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" I'm asking if you'd like to give us a reason to fill it out. I watched the most controlled woman I had ever met become visibly nervous for what might have been the first time in her adult life. Are you sure? She asked, and I told her yes, and meant it completely. We didn't kiss in the cafeteria. That happened later, that same evening, outside my mother's restaurant after we'd eaten dinner there again, standing under the awning while the last of the closing staff turned off lights behind the glass, and the street had gone quiet enough to hear the traffic light change 2 blocks over. My mother had hugged Adriana goodbye at the door with the same unceremonious affection she gave everyone she'd decided to keep, and Adriana had looked, walking out into the evening air, lighter than I had ever seen her, like something she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down somewhere safe. I keep waiting to feel like this is a mistake, she said, under the awning, hands in her coat pockets like she didn't trust them not to reach for me without permission. I don't. I want you to know that. I've been waiting for months and it hasn't come. Maybe it isn't coming, I said. Maybe it isn't. She looked at me for a long moment, close enough now that I could smell bergamot and rain-cooled stone and, underneath it, something warm and unguarded that I'd come to recognize as entirely her, unfiltered by any performance at all. Can I kiss you? You didn't have to ask. I wanted to anyway. I told her yes, and she kissed me like she'd been rehearsing restraint for months and had finally decided to put it down completely. Her hand found my jaw carefully, thumb along my cheekbone, like she was still checking, even mid-kiss, that I hadn't changed my mind. I hadn't. I pulled her closer to prove it, one hand fisted in the front of her coat, and felt her breath catch against my mouth in a way that undid every careful, controlled version of her I'd watched perform for the rest of the world. What came after was slower than either of us expected, and better for the pace. I discovered she owned an absurdly expensive espresso machine she barely knew how to operate, all chrome and unnecessary buttons, and spent one whole Saturday morning laughing at her reading its manual with the same grim focus she brought to acquisition contracts, muttering about pre-infusion timing like it was a hostile takeover clause. She stayed over at my apartment for the first time a few weeks in, and was woken at 2 a.m. by upstairs neighbors having, by the sound of it, a passionate argument about a video game, an experience she found so foreign to her soundproofed life that she brought it up at 3 separate dinners afterward, genuinely fascinated by the concept of hearing strangers exist above your ceiling. I left a bottle of my favorite hot sauce in her pristine kitchen, tucked between a jar of imported olive oil and something French I couldn't pronounce, and she complained about its presence with real theatrical offense, calling it an act of culinary sabotage, while using it, when she thought I wasn't looking, on nearly everything she cooked. I caught her once, standing at her own stove at 11 at night, quietly dousing scrambled eggs in it, and she denied the whole thing so unconvincingly that I didn't even bother arguing, just let her keep the bottle where it was. We grocery shopped together once, and she genuinely had no idea what ordinary things cost, stood in front of a shelf of pasta for a full minute like the price tag might be a typo, which I found both funny and, in some small way, sad, evidence of just how far outside normal life she'd built her routines over the years. I refused, more than once, to let her solve minor inconveniences by simply purchasing her way past them, told her flatly that fixing my broken umbrella by buying me an entire luggage set of new ones missed the point of what I'd actually asked for, which was 5 minutes of her attention while I complained. She learned, slowly, to ask whether I wanted a solution before she supplied one, which for a woman used to being obeyed, the instant she identified a problem, was its own kind of growth, small and unglamorous and completely real. We had a real argument, unrelated to work, proof to both of us that this wasn't some idealized version of a relationship immune to friction. She canceled a dinner for an emergency board call and didn't tell me until I'd been sitting alone at a restaurant for 40 minutes, wondering if I'd been stood up. I told her exactly how that felt. She didn't send flowers to apologize, which I'd half expected, and would have refused anyway. She just said she was sorry, specifically, for the silence rather than the cancellation, and asked what she could do differently next time. It was a small moment. It mattered more than almost anything grander could have. She kept coming back to my mother's restaurant on her own, without me asking, until my mother told me one evening, wiping down a table Adriana had just left, that the woman watched me across every meal like she still couldn't quite believe I'd come back. There was one evening, not long before a difficult stretch leading up to my heat, when I asked her to stay close without asking for anything more specific than that. She asked exactly what kind of comfort I wanted before doing anything at all, which, by then, didn't surprise me. It was simply who she'd become with me. We spent the night curled together on my couch, sharing scent, not talking much, and it was one of the gentlest nights of my life, without ever needing to be anything more than that. Months later, an opportunity came to her, a major international expansion that would require her overseas for most of the year, leading a division the board considered central to the company's next decade. The old Adriana, the one from the beginning of all this, would have decided on her own and informed me afterward as a courtesy, the way she'd once decided about the ventilation, the way she'd once decided about her own recusal. This Adriana brought the offer to me unfinished, sat across from me at our kitchen table with the term sheet still unsigned, and laid out everything she wanted from it and everything she was afraid of losing. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, which from her felt like its own small miracle. "I want to know what you think before I decide anything, not because I need your permission, but because whatever I choose is going to change both our lives, and I'm done making that kind of choice alone in a room." I told her I was stunned, honestly, by how much that shift meant to me, more than the offer itself, more than anything the expansion could have paid her. We talked through it for 2 nights running, like 2 adults building something together, rather than one person accommodating the other's ambitions. I told her I refused to be the reason she turned down something that mattered to her, without at least trying to make it work, and she told me she refused to treat me as someone who simply followed wherever her career led. We landed, eventually, on a plan involving limited travel windows, remote leadership stretches where she'd run the expansion from home for weeks at a time, in-person trips scheduled around both our calendars rather than just hers, and my own career staying exactly where it belonged, entirely mine, unaffected and unmoved by wherever her job happened to be that quarter. The specific arrangement mattered less in the end than the fact that we'd reached it by actually talking, by treating the decision as something that belonged to both of us instead of something one of us delivered to the other already finished. It's been almost a year now since the first afternoon she claimed our table and dared anyone to take the empty chair. The cafeteria looks different these days, redesigned under my division's recommendations. More daylight from windows that used to be blocked by decorative paneling nobody remembered approving. Real scent-neutral zones instead of decorative ones that existed mostly on paper. Protected break periods for hourly staff who used to eat standing up between shifts, because sitting down felt like an indulgence they couldn't justify. A quieter section for people who need it. Better seating throughout that doesn't make anyone feel like they're on display. It isn't lavish, it's better, which was always the point. The distinction I'd spent 2 years trying to teach a company that mostly understood one and not the other. I lead my own division now, one I earned through a process I fought to make transparent, protections and all, and my team argues with Adriana regularly, in meetings where she still terrifies people who show up unprepared, still corrects bad numbers on site without raising her voice, still has no patience whatsoever for phrases like synergistic alignment, will actually stop a meeting cold to ask someone what a sentence like that is supposed to mean. She hasn't softened into someone unrecognizable, and I wouldn't have wanted her to. She's just become someone who asks before she acts, someone who listens past the first sentence instead of solving the problem before the second one arrives, someone employees have slowly stopped flinching around, at least a little, at least enough that I've watched a junior analyst correct her math in a meeting without visibly bracing for consequences afterward. She eats with other people sometimes now, too. Small groups, junior staff who still can't quite believe she remembers their names, remembers which of them mentioned a sick parent 3 weeks ago, remembers whose project got cut, and asks about it anyway. And some days I tell the whole table it's full, because I want her to myself, because some habits are worth keeping exactly as selfish as they started, and she never once argues with that. This afternoon I was late, held up by a meeting that ran 20 minutes over, and by the time I reached the cafeteria it was crowded. The good kind of crowded. full of noise and trays and people who no longer look at our table like it's a headline waiting to happen. Adriana was already there. I watched from across the room as someone approached the empty chair across from her, the way people had once approached it a year ago without knowing any better. She glanced at the chair. Then she looked up, found me through the crowd, and raised one eyebrow, silently asking a question she would once have simply answered on her own. "Do you want me to save it?" I gave her a small nod, small enough that only someone watching for it would have caught it, and she caught it instantly, the way she caught almost everything about me now. Only then did she tell the stranger the seat was taken, her voice carrying easily across the noise of the room, and I crossed the floor toward the table that had somehow, over one long and complicated year, become the center of my whole life, weaving between trays and conversations and the ordinary Tuesday noise of a cafeteria that no longer felt like it was watching either of us. "You're late," she said when I sat down. "You could have eaten without me." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She considered the question the way she considered everything, carefully, like it deserved a true answer instead of an easy one. "Because lunch is better when you come back," she said, and went back to her food like she hadn't just said something that settled somewhere permanent in my chest. I used to think being chosen by someone with that much power would cost me whatever independence I'd spent my whole career building. I was wrong about the kind of choosing that mattered. She never once decided for me again after that first hard lesson. She just kept making room, kept asking, kept leaving the choice open long enough for me to walk across the room and take it. I sat down in the chair she'd saved, the same one, always the same one, and started eating lunch with the woman who had learned, slowly and imperfectly and completely, that love was never about deciding on my behalf. It was about setting a place and waiting to see if I'd come sit in it.